I'm going to talk about Vagrant. I joined the Cerebrata team after the reorg, and it turns out that the Cerebrata website is written on Ruby on Rails, and I didn't feel like wasting my life trying to set up a Rails environment in Windows and getting the path everywhere correct and using one of the many installers and then importing some gem that uses native code and then it doesn't compile and blah, blah, blah. So it's annoying and there's better things to do. Plus, I think there's 6 new team members, so eventually every one of us would have had to go through that same amount of pain. So I thought, why not use some cool tech and make it go for everyone at once? So I looked at Vagrant, which I've heard of before but hadn't really had a chance to use. So Vagrant is a virtual machine manager, sort of in some loose sense of the term. And the idea is that you create a manifest file that describes what base VM you want to create a VM from, what packages you want to install on that thing, how you want to configure the network and possible other configuration stuff. And you put this manifest file in your source control repository, and then the next guy who comes along can check out the source repository and then execute the manifest file with Vagrant, and out pops a VM that is running and configured and has everything installed, and you can carry on hacking with your project. So a few sort of details about Vagrant. There's a bunch of VM providers that are the bits that actually spin up VMs, and those give you facilities for using certain VM technologies. So it uses VirtualBox out of the box. You can also use VMware, which apparently is more stable and runs a bit faster. And then there's a bunch of community contributions for spinning things up in Amazon or various other public cloud providers, spinning stuff up in private cloud, or then using Linux hypervisors, Docker, so forth. There's also a bunch of provisioning tools. So again, out of the box, it does shell scripts and a bunch of provisioning tools like Chef, Puppet, and so forth. And you can mix and match these together, so you can do some of your provisioning with shell scripts and then do Puppet, for example, after that, and so on. So I'm basically going to demo now how this works. So you can check out the project from source control, run Vagrant up on it, and then SSH into the thing and launch your project and edit source files from your local desktop inside the VM via network mount, and then access the service over forwarded ports from your local machine. So let's see if this works. This takes quite a while, so I've cheated and done some of this beforehand. So this is the Cerebrata website. We then run Vagrant up, and it basically creates a VM for us. Then there's a whole bunch of provisioning stuff, because it updates apt-get from the network, it installs a bunch of Ruby gems and so on. But at the end, we will have a running VM, and we can SSH into it. And there's a magic folder called /vagrant, which is a network mount of my folder where I started from on my local machine. So this is effectively the git checkout that I'd done earlier. And I can run my Rails web server. Somewhere here I have Chrome instance, and now if we hit the port forward that I've set up as part, which is in the Vagrant file, we get to the Cerebrata site. So now to show that I can actually edit this thing, we'll change the title and hopefully it works. Oops. No purchasing. And we hit refresh, and it's magic. And that's pretty much it. So what else you can do with Vagrant is you can shut down your VMs. So the image still resides on your disk. You can then bring it up again. You can also destroy your VM, then it goes away. You can package the image that you've built, so host that in a network share somewhere and use that as a starting point, so you don't have to do the provisioning always from scratch. That's about it, I think. Also, let's have a look at the Vagrant file since we're here. So this is the manifest file out of the box. It basically says this is your base image. Then you can configure some forward ports. By default, it forwards SSH, but I've added another port for the network server, the web server for the Rails app. And then we define at the end how we want to provision the VM. So I'm using a shell script, which is then embedded in the beginning of the file. And this is basically one line is one command of shell script. So we update apt-get, install git and curl, install some Rails dependencies, and set up some environment variables. But you can also use Puppet and Chef, which then makes it all a bit more declarative. Any questions? I'm not sure if I'm going out of over time or not. Kevin?
Where do you store the base image? Or do you share that with the other 5 people on the team?
So Vagrant has a bunch of base images available online, so you can use Vagrant to download one of those. So the one that I have is just a very basic Ubuntu installation.
Can you spin some of it? Can you point out the AMI and spin it up at EC2 or something? Or?
You'd have to change the Vagrant file to say that you want to use a different provider then. Actually, I'm not quite sure what the box format is. Presumably it's some virtual box flavor. Yep.
When you said it was a development environment, I guess I was imagining that it was going to be like the IDE would be in there as well, your remote desktop, there would be, you're actually just doing presumably Rails and the web server as the compilations happen in the virtual machine, but you're editing the text files.
Yeah, so I think one of the advantages of Vagrant is that you can use all the tooling that you have on your own desktop machine without having to install all the other stuff that you need to run a Rails app, in this case, on your own machine. So if you like to do stuff in Studio, then you can edit your Rails project in Visual Studio. And then, because it all happens over a network mount, the Rails server will pick up the changes and it will live reload the pages that you've edited and the code and so on. So you don't have to move all your development work into Linux to do Rails apps. You can run the Rails app in the Linux VM and then do your development on your Windows box with the tooling that you're used to. Yep.
So I was curious about the Docker integration. So does that work in both directions? So you can take a Docker config and turn it into a Vagrant box, and also you can take a Vagrant config and turn it into a Docker.
So you can use Docker is a bit strange because in some Vagrant has 2 plugins for Docker. One is using it as a provider, so as a VM provider. The other one is using it as a provisioning tool. So you can, for the provider side of things, you can build Docker images with Vagrant and run those somewhere. If you use Docker as a provisioning plugin, then you can spin up a VM and then install a bunch of Docker images to run on that VM. Right. So there's you should read more about it because it's complicated. But there's two ways at least of using Docker with Vagrant. Anyone else? All right.